It's bigger, better, expanded Productivity Awareness Week 2022 under the theme Expanding National Consciousness Towards Greater Productivity.
Discussion on energy awareness, the reduction strategy. This is part of the suite of activities to observe Productivity Awareness Week, October 17th to 21st, 2022 in St. Lucia. The theme for this year's observance is expanding national consciousness towards greater productivity. I am Judith Ephraim Schmidt, Program Director for Sustainable Energy at the OECS Commission, and it is my privilege to moderate this session. To help me delve into this theme a little more, we have a distinguished panel of persons from various organizations dealing with energy in St. Lucia. From the government of St. Lucia, we have Mr. Terence Gillard, Chief Energy Officer, and Mrs. Kern Antoine Gabriel, Energy Officer. Mr. Nicholas Barnard joins us. He is the Vice President of the St. Lucia Manufacturers Association. And to round it off, we have Mrs. Alison Asia, Chief Executive Officer of the National Utilities Regulatory Commission, NUC. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so we will be looking at our theme, which really tries to incorporate and establish a link between energy and productivity. So we'll start first with the government of St. Lucia. Mr. Gillard, now we know that the government of St. Lucia has really been focusing on sustainable energy. So a lot of strides have been made in this regard, and let me first of all commend the government on being part of this session. I think it really helps to mainstream sustainable energy and make it more relatable to the average St. Lucian. But can you just share a little bit more in terms of how does the government see sustainable energy contributing to productivity at the national level?
Thank you, Judith, and let me express my gratitude to the team from Finance for setting up this panel discussion, and of course to our distinguished panelists as well. The government's policy approach comes from a recognition that the concept of sustainable energy is one which has the potential to resolve some of the critical issues we are facing now economically. On the one hand, we see what's happening most recently, the Ukraine crisis and the issue of oil price volatility and the uncertainty that's in the global oil market. At the same time, this is against the background of St. Lucia's very heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels, which makes the need for diversifying, for transitioning our energy sector to a more sustainable path quite critical at this time. And the approach, the three-pronged approach, I think that has been articulated by the government includes pursuing energy efficiency, energy conservation, and of course, a recognition that increasing the share of indigenous renewables into St. Lucia's energy mix can impact very positively our economic competitiveness and improve our situation for all customer categories within our country. So we can look at energy efficiency and energy conservation. Both concepts refer to saving energy through its wise and rational use. So this is what the two of them yield, a reduction in energy consumption. And of course, we've already established the linkage between economic competitiveness and energy. But to be more specific, energy efficiency refers to the use of technologies to reduce the amount of energy required to provide an output or a service. So we can get the same by using less, using technology. Whereas energy conservation, on the other hand, refers to reduction of energy consumption by changing our behavior. So simple practices such as turning off lights when we're not in a room, turning off an AC, making sure we have no leakages, and etc. These are behavioral practices that we can implement or adopt to reduce our energy consumption. We reduce consumption, we reduce cost.
Okay, thank you. I think you've done a very good job at elaborating and helping us really understand this theme, which is quite fitting. Mr. Bernard, so you represent a very important segment of our society, and Mr. Gillard has already outlined some of the challenges that we are being faced with in this context of the energy crisis. He also expanded on how we could use reduction strategies to support our growth and development. For the Manufacturers Association, how do you see this new challenge? Is it something new for you? And how has it impacted your manufacturers? And what is currently the strategy being employed by the association to support its members?
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. Our sector incorporates very small manufacturers up to very large manufacturers. Energy is a major cost in overall operating costs, and as such, we have to look at our energy consumption per unit produced. And in some cases, energy can be 10%, 12% of total operating costs. It can be as low as 3%. We have been trying for many years, going back to 2010, when I think we had the national energy policy, to get recognition of the high cost of energy for our operations. We've looked at renewable energy. Obviously, we've looked at the cap on what we could have produced for ourselves. We've also looked at ways to save energy through whether it be insulation or whether it be using variable speed motors in automation, or whether it be using cooling methods or heating methods that are that draw less energy, things like that. So we've looked at all our options to conserve. But certainly what we really are interested in is being able to produce renewable energy, get the kilowatt hour price down or cost down for our operations. That's why I'm really interested in this.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing on what has been happening within your sector. Mrs. Jean, you come from the NERC, and I don't think everybody is familiar with the NERC. Can you just share with us briefly what is the NERC? What are its objectives, and what it has been doing towards achieving its objective at this time?
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to my distinguished panel. I think we will have a very fluid discussion. So the NERC is an acronym for the National Utilities Regulatory Commission, which was formed in 2016. It's a multi-sector regulator which is responsible for licensing and regulating the electricity, water, and sewage sectors. So for now, one of our major licensees is the water and sewage company WASCO, and by virtue of the Electricity Supply Amendment Act, we are now expected to license and regulate electricity from renewable energy sources. So, as Terence said, we are expected to implement government's policy, and we take our cue from the National Energy Policy, albeit of 2010, but I know that it is under review as we speak. And so we attempt to regulate the sector, provide information, create the enabling environment for investment in renewable sources, but more specifically in educating our public on the avenues that they have for achieving energy efficiency, energy conservation, and utilizing our indigenous sources in order for us to regulate, to produce electricity. By indigenous sources, we're speaking specifically of solar photovoltaic generation, which is prevalent on the island, but we also would be responsible for regulating wind, geothermal, and the other sources. So my organization really provides permits to people who want to generate utilizing solar photovoltaic. But for now, because there is a pilot project for solar PV, we are constrained by a limit of 5 kilowatts for domestic generation and 25 kilowatts for commercial generation. So as we roll out the legislative framework, we're hoping that very soon we would be able to accept proposals from independent power producers in order for us to include a larger share of renewable energies into the electricity mix on the island.
Okay. So perhaps we can go back to the government of St. Lucia. So we have heard from the NERC, we understand better their role in terms of supporting the government and the national vision for sustainable energy. We've heard from the Manufacturers Association what they're doing. And really, government is the one who sets the vision and, lays down the foundation for the rest of society to build on. Mrs. Antoine, can you share a little bit in terms of what government has been working in terms of its policy or perhaps supporting legislation, and what is it hoping to achieve in doing so, and perhaps what has been the progress? I know you are in development at the moment, but just share with us what is ongoing and what do we have to look forward to.
Thank you, Judith. As mentioned by Mrs. Jha, that the National Energy Policy of 2010 is currently being reviewed, or it has been reviewed, and we have gone out to public consultation. So you look at from the residential to the commercial, where schools. So we want to promote local enfranchisement. We want to promote cost containment. We also want to promote the regulatory framework, so where we can use regulation as our basis for promoting development within the sector.
And I mean, it's been a journey, but perhaps if we go back to Mr. Gillard, what would you say are the major milestones in our energy transition to date?
The milestones, I would say, we would have to go back to the 50s. Or may I say, in the 1800s, there was a recognition by some of the colonialists at the time of the value of the hot springs and the ancillary uses it was being put to. That's application, uses of energy, alternative uses of energy. But having very focused decisions or discussions on energy transition, these have taken place in more recent times. And what we have seen is after the approval of the National Energy Policy of 2010, and importantly, I think I should have mentioned the environmental aspects of sustainable energy. This was recognized as a very important point. Obviously, we know that our planet is warming, and the energy sector is responsible for quite a significant portion of the greenhouse gas emissions that we have today. And therefore, any serious attempt to address the matter of climate change has to involve the energy sector in a very large way. So the energy policy of 2010 looked at that issue as well, including the other imperatives of diversifying our energy mix, the issue of increased inclusion of renewables and so on. From the 2010 policy, we saw the setting up of the regulator, because there was a recognition that, or a very strong feeling that you can achieve efficiency within the sector through competition, from some level of competition, and therefore there was a move to unbundle renewable energy generation based on the fact that you had a vertically integrated utility operating within the sector under statutory license. So they control the entire electricity value chain from generation to sale. So moving on from there, a national energy transition strategy was developed, which was done in a very collaborative way, and an integrated resource plan that was forward-looking. It projected demands up to 20 years in the future and looked at various resources and supply-side options to meet those demands, that considers our climate obligations and the other development commitments that the government had made at the time. So we have various scenarios the technical and economic analyses were conducted, and we see, for example, the impact on ratepayers, the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and so on, and we know that these will factor resilience into our electricity sector.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps we can go back to Mr. Bernard. So government has just shared, in terms of what they have been working towards, and you've also shared in terms of what the Manufacturers Association has been implementing. How do you see government supporting your work, especially in the context of the theme that we are discussing here today in terms of productivity and reductions? Those policy documents, how have they supported you? How have you been able to take advantage of those? And are there any new opportunities that you see for the sector going forward?
Well, we've discussed renewable energy for over a decade. We've looked at targets. For instance, there was a target of 35% renewable energy by 2020. 2 years later, if we have 2% or 3% renewable energy, we're lucky. So we need to be consistent. We need to adhere to our targets. That's what we need to do. Driving Castries to Gros Islet, you see all of those reefer containers, those frozen food containers. And you can only imagine the consumption of electricity that's going on there and what it does to our cost of living, because essentially that's passed to us as a consumer. And in that same vein, you look at all the roofs going from Castries to Gros Islet, and they're all empty. And you can easily envisage those roofs being covered with solar, and essentially those freezers being run by God's gift, the sun. So essentially, this is the problem. We need to really commit to something and adhere to that commitment. That's what I see we need to do, because otherwise we will continue discussing this for years to come, which in fact we have been doing for over a decade now. Luckily, we have some very committed people, and I'm hoping that they can really push that through.
So some persons have gotten it, yeah? They have understood what sustainable energy can do for them. They see it in terms of their bottom line, and they've been able to take advantage of this. But there are still a few companies, I think, that, they have some way to go. What do you think can be done to support those that are a little less developed in terms of their sustainable energy strategies within a company context?
Well, I think it's about education. Simply, when you run the numbers, you can see that you get an ROI of, say, 5 to 6 years on a solar installation. And it's to basically show that and show exactly how it's done, the financing, etc., how it's done. And that's really what's required, the education. And people come to me and they say to me, but you have batteries by your factory. What are you doing with all those batteries? They say, but you don't get it. There are no batteries in a solar PV installation. There are no batteries. It's a very clean installation. So I think education, and if the government has the resources to educate through NTN or whatever it may be, this will help and convince a lot of people, and even the small people. Maybe say that we cannot afford it, but then when you show them that ROI of 5 or 6 years, they suddenly the spark goes off.
All right, thanks. So we hear from the manufacturers, and really the NUC as the independent body who is supposed to support and have oversight of our regulation. It is a very important role. It's a role that really serves the interests of various persons and publics. What has been the experience so far? Who has been coming to the NUC? What are they requesting? And what more can be made available to persons in terms of benefiting from the services that the NUC can provide?
Yeah, well, I'm happy that the Manufacturers Association is here, because they are the drivers of economic activity on the island. And linking it to productivity, we know that the formula for productivity includes inputs and outputs. And so whatever manufacturers put into their process is what's going to turn out into their product, but more importantly, their price. And so electricity being one of the major inputs to everything that the manufacturers produce, if they can get the costs lower, then for sure we would be able to have less expensive products in our sector. Another major sector would be our tourism sector, and we at the NUC, we speak very often to the St. Lucia Tourism and Hotel and Tourism Association The people that we see within recent times is the group of prospective investors. There are a lot of investors that are coming to us. I had a meeting with one this morning who are offering several different solutions for our energy mix and seeking to come in as independent power producers to sell electricity to our utility at a much lower rate. What we are kind of hindered by is the enactment of the new legislation that would allow us to go through the competitive bidding process to seek the best prices for the country. But more importantly, we have to recognize that we have a utility that produces electricity and has a high degree of reliability. St. Lucia is one of the countries that I believe enjoys fairly reliable electricity. So our power outages are not as frequent as there are in other Caribbean countries or in other countries in the world. And so the role of the regulator is to balance off the stakeholder interest. So we're looking to provide to ensure that our sectors can get inputs, and in that case, electricity, at a much lower rate and more sustainable. But at the same time, we want our utility to remain with the level of reliability that they are producing. Because renewable energy is an intermittent source, or solar and wind are intermittent sources of energy. That means that the generation fluctuates. So you do not want to have an influx of intermittent power onto the grid that destabilizes the electricity grid and causes reliability, power outages, and so on. So the role of the NUC is really to cause the utility to meet the demands for our sectors, cause our sector players to get electricity at a lower rate, whether through energy efficient measures and other things, which they can do on their own, and also have St. Lucia with a fairly reliable source of electricity. So it's a kind of a balancing act that has to be played, and the regulator is key to having that.
A very important role. Perhaps going back to the theme, we speak of reductions, and when we think of reductions, I think most of us think of, energy efficiency and energy conservation. And it's not exactly the most exciting of the topics under sustainable energy, but it is very impactful. It can be very effective within a short period of time. Mrs. Antoine Gabriel, what has the government of St. Lucia been doing to support energy audits, which is seen as a tool for really understanding our energy consumption and for identifying opportunities?
Okay, first of all, the government recently had some audits done on 23 of their buildings, because it begins at home. Government must lead by example. So by conducting these audits, we have analyzed which buildings consume more power, and we have looked at what can be done to reduce consumption. So we are also looking at ways where we could have persons trained. So currently we are looking into that avenue. So we would engage our various stakeholders where they could become certified energy managers. So persons would be equipped. So for example, persons within the hotel and tourism sector would be equipped to analyze their electrical installation and do what it takes, the necessary actions that would help that entity reduce their consumption. And also that would also reflect, it will reflect on the bills, and it will be good for our atmosphere, our environment as well.
Right. Perhaps,
if I
please.
may just add to what Mrs. Gabriel is saying, energy audits are very, very important to everyone. So while the projects that she alluded to are within the government departments, it's important that every household do their own internal audits, because you may find some very simple things that can be done that can reduce electricity. For example, you may have your refrigerator, you have it for 10, 15 years, and the lining of the door allows for the energy to escape. That increases your electricity bill. So a simple rectification of that appliance can cause you to reduce your energy. You have air conditioned units. Some people, based on the way they regulate air condition, can increase or decrease your consumption. Your power, the under the doors, the lining of the doors, and several other things. So I think at the household, at the commercial, at the industrial level, it's extremely important to carry out these energy audits for yourself. Look at your electricity bill and see, why did my bill go up this month? Is it the fuel surcharge? Did I consume more electricity? And the bills that we have show us it actually shows us the monthly consumption, so we are able to monitor the high months. For example, for me, my high months, I can envisage my high months. During the summer months, my bill goes up because there's more air conditioning being used. November, December, January, February, it goes down because there's less air conditioning. So energy audits are extremely important. They should not reside only within government departments, but every single consumer should pay greater attention to their energy consumption and seek ways to reduce them. Another thing, we may have televisions. Some of the televisions that we have may be high consumers of electricity. We leave them on. Some people believe by leaving on the television during the night, it will deter thieves and so on, so they leave it on. But it burns electricity. Try turning it off. Try monitoring your systems and see how best you can work towards reducing consumption.
And might I add something that is often overlooked, routine inspections. For commercial buildings, every 2 years it is recommended that a routine inspection be carried out by the inspectorate, because that will determine whether or not your electrical installation has degraded. If you have a degraded installation, that will lead to losses, and more losses would equate to a higher consumption, because now you're requiring more power or more energy to carry out a function or something in an activity. So we need to curtail the losses at home in conjunction with what was mentioned by Mrs. Zhe in the home, like the simple inspections and so on.
So thank you very much for those very practical tips. We will take a break, and when we come back, we will delve a little more into what can be done at both the individual and the national level.
Thank you.
Okay.
The world's climate is changing, and that affects all of us. Storms are becoming increasingly intense. Periods of intense drought and heavy rain stress farm animals and destroy our crops. Higher average ocean temperatures kill our coral reefs and change the migratory patterns of fish. St. Lucia contributes only 0.0015% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but is doing its part, along with countries around the world, to reduce the emissions that are warming our world and changing our climate. These efforts are called mitigation. But decades of emissions have already changed the climate, and the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today will increase average global temperatures even more. We need to adapt, that is, do everything we can to prepare for and respond to the actual and expected negative effects of climate change. And everyone has a role to play. We need to protect our crops, build homes that withstand storms, and keep our drains and waterways free of garbage to help us recover or bounce back from climatic events. Learn more about the Government of St. Lucia's National Adaptation Plan and the steps you can take to protect yourself and your fellow St. Lucians.
So welcome back to our discussion on sustainable energy. We have been discussing the topic of energy awareness, the reduction strategy. And our panel, just before we broke, were discussing practical tips for helping manage energy, looking at energy audits, how they contribute to you understanding how we use our energy and where there are opportunities for us to reduce. I think oftentimes persons think that when we look at energy efficiency, that they have to be major investments. But of course, they're not. Recently, the OECS was supporting some of our member states, showing them how we could just make simple changes, like you said, within buildings that use energy. It may just be positioning an appliance differently or ensuring that, like you said, the monitoring, perhaps every day for a month, try to see how you use your energy. And from this, you can have savings, which would allow you now to make some of the investments that may require a little more financing. But certainly, Mr. Barnard, I know you have a lot to add to this topic. What has been some of the challenges? Because I know sometimes we do have that research, we have that data in terms of what can be done, but there may be some challenges in actually accessing funding or taking it to the next step, where you move from the energy audit to the actual implementation of those activities or interventions to support the more efficient energy.
Well, you have to make sure you have the expertise to do the energy audit, and you have to have the funding to pay for that expertise. And I've seen some energy audits before, and they're very worthwhile. Whether it be looking at why we have a 7.5 horsepower pump when we could get away for 5 horsepower pump, looking at all the processes to see whether we have fixed motors that could be changed to variable speed motors, or looking at time and motion studies of how we do particular tasks with the machinery that we have. So, and matching, capability, capacity, etc. So I have seen them, and they're very worthwhile. And as Mrs. Jean said a while ago, an inverter-driven air conditioner saves 30% on a regular air conditioner. It consumes 30% less. An LED bulb consumes 75% less than an incandescent bulb. You can tint your windows to stop the sun coming in. You can insulate your roofs to stop the heat coming in. There's so many things that you can do, and the energy audit will pull that up if it's a comprehensive enough energy audit. Implementation obviously would come after a report is written and the recommendations are made, and it's up to the individual companies or entities to follow those recommendations. And obviously it's in their interest to do so, because there are major savings. I mean, just the one example I've given there of a 7.5 horsepower motor as opposed to a 5 horsepower motor, there's significant savings over a year just on one motor. So I'm a firm believer in energy audits, but again, the implementation of those recommendations is crucial.
Okay. So I know government has been supporting energy efficiency by providing a number of incentives. Do you mind sharing a little bit as to what is currently being supported and what is the process for accessing those?
Yes. Just to add to Mr. Barnard's comments, before I address the incentives question, it's critical, and from government perspective, we look at the problem, the approach to the issue as a pyramid. At the bottom, the broad base of that pyramid would be energy conservation measures, changing our behavior. Most times, the costs are relatively low, very short payback period. So we advise for the implementation of energy conservation measures. It yields a reduction in consumption. Higher on the pyramid, we go to energy efficiency. Oftentimes, for example, lighting, shorter payback periods. You could look at the other approaches to financial analysis of these investments, and they all look more attractive. you further reduce consumption. And then we size solar PV systems or renewable energy systems. So you have a holistic approach, and again, you optimize your spending on the intervention. So it's conducting the audit, as we're all saying, but it's also implementing the recommendations. And again, an audit is really the monitoring, verification, and analysis of energy usage within a plant, whether it be a business, a home, and so on. Regarding energy incentives, yes, the government has put in place several measures for incentivizing the use of energy efficient equipment items. So for example, inverter technology, air conditioning units and so on, once these get to our borders, they're either attracted by tariff, under the CARICOM external tariff. Alternatively, you have applications being made to the Department of Infrastructure, Ports and Transport, the Energy Division, which does the verification, and then customs would apply the incentives where the import duties and so on are written off. So government does have incentives in place.
And might I add, recently we have, in terms of society and St. Lucians trying to play their part, we have seen an uptake in electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. When we speak about energy conservation, we often overlook walking. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time in traffic trying to get to work. Probably if we carpooled, if we took the bus, we would get to work on time because we spend a lot of time in traffic. We would be able to be more productive because coming in on time, if we need to get a bite to eat, because sometimes we get to work and we wait 8 o'clock, that's the time we're having breakfast. So if we come in and we're early, we're settled, and then we are able to be more productive by just probably carpooling or taking a bus or riding a bicycle to work.
It's certainly a nice way of pulling us back to the topic of productivity. Yes. Certainly the transportation sector is a growing consumer. It's a big consumer, but it's an even greater growing consumer of energy, not only in St. Lucia, but for most globally. Small island developing states. Mm-hmm. So let's move a little bit to the topic. We've been looking at energy efficiency in this whole conversation on the reduction strategy, and we've said that the energy audit is a vital first step, so it will help us understand how we're using energy and where we can save. And then this really highlights some of the opportunities for conservation and energy efficiency. But let's move a little bit to renewable energy. And I think that's where most people can readily see the opportunity. But how have we been progressing? I know St. Lucia, for instance, has some sustainable energy targets. I know a lot of work has gone into preparing a resource planning, which shows that we have a lot of potential. Of course, these are never easy undertakings. But can you just share from the government's perspective where we think we have the most potential and what we are doing to move towards really accessing and achieving those targets?
Thank you for this question, Judith. Okay, so government's targets emerge from our NDC commitments, our nationally determined contributions as part of our Paris climate agreements. And these are to achieve by 2025 within St. Lucia's electricity mix, 35% installed capacity of renewable energy. And by 2030, up that to 50%. The truth is, it does not stand in, these targets don't stand in a vacuum. And noting that the only way, or the best way for us to up our renewable energy integration is through private sector participation and investment in renewable energy. And in order for that to do so, whilst the government has, for example, undertaken to establish a regulator, and one of the main purposes is really to attract investment. You create that sort of confidence in the market so investors would invest. But the legislative framework is still in process. So whilst the regulator is in place, there's no formal procedure or regulatory procedure for licensing IPPs. Setting
just share with us what are IPPs?
An independent power producer, apologies. Licensing independent power producers would come on the generation market to produce electricity from renewable sources and to provide that to Lucelec as the off-taker, so that's not in place yet. as well as setting tariffs in terms of how the interconnection between an IPP and a LUCILEC, we normally refer to a power purchase agreement contract. How will that be negotiated and so on? All of these have to be put in place. In terms of setting up technical and operating standards, how do you interconnect to the grid? What sort of standards must you meet? And this is where, again, the NERC comes in, but the legislation has to provide them with that authority. The government has recognized that and is in the process of finalizing that legislation. So at the end of it, we would hope to be in a position where investors can come onto the market and we would see an increase in our renewable energy integration, whether it be solar, wind, and of course geothermal. The government is pursuing a geothermal exploration project, which we can also talk about.
Yes, we'll come back to geothermal, but I just wanted to pull in the NERC now and just to share some thoughts in terms of how we have progressed as a country when it comes to regulations, specifically for renewable energy and where we need to get to.
Yeah, well, Terence started the historical perspective on the electricity sector. I could say from as early as 2006, the government of St. Lucia started off by providing to households what was called energy-saving light bulbs. So retrofitting of light bulbs to households around the island in order to remove incandescent bulbs from our system. And that was a source or an attempt to start the whole process of energy efficiency. We have progressed, I believe, to LEDs, and for some households that can afford, we have they have installed LED lights. I believe there was supposed to be the complete ban of incandescent bulbs on the island, and I hope that at this stage it is so, that you would not be able to have an incandescent bulb available at a store. While these new devices were more expensive, but they led to reduction in consumption. Then the government attempted to start what was called an ESERA project, the Eastern Caribbean Energy Regulators Authority, initially, but it morphed into an agency. And again, that was an attempt by the governments of St. Lucia and Grenada to create a regional regulator for electricity. Since that did not pan out in the way that it was envisaged, the governments of Grenada and St. Lucia individually set up their regulators, and that's how the NERC came about from what was originally the National Water and Sewerage Commission, NWSC. It's now come as the NERC. So from where we are now, we're poised to harness much more renewable energy into the system. With the new legislation coming on board, we would be able to attract investors who are able to generate electricity at a utility scale, which means that they may be able to utilize whether solar, wind. I'm now seeing a concept with solar and hydrogen coming together. So they're able to produce large generation that they can sell to the utility. So far, we're seeing progression for our country, albeit extremely slow. Because if we had a target of 30% renewable energy by 2020, we've missed that. We're now 35% at 2025, which seems a bit ambitious. But for sectors like manufacturing and tourism and commercial and industrial, there there are opportunities for inclusion of their own renewable energy generation in order to add on to the reliance of electricity from Lucilec. The other aspect that I think our economic sectors should pursue and see it as an investment is utilizing external financing to retrofit their establishments. So we spoke about inverters and so on. It's kind of a no-brainer that you go to the bank, or financial institution, and you get a loan to retrofit your establishment. With inverters, we put in solar PV, you change to LED, and whatever else your energy audits recommend. The savings from your consumption will be able to pay back your loan. So it does not come from your bottom line or increases your operational cost. So in the long run, you have a more efficient establishment. You are able to produce at less cost than before, and your returns are going to be greater. So I think that is where we need to take our country, because we have to look at national development as one where our economic sectors can be more productive at a lower cost. Our country is getting expensive. We must remain competitive, and we must be attractive to investment in order for us to run. So we're talking just about energy, but we have to look at energy in a much broader sense, one that leads to greater social and economic development.
Certainly, and I think you've raised a very important point. I want to get to the Manufacturers Association, but I want to take you up on a point that you made in terms of accessing the financing, because I think that has been a critical hurdle for many of the manufacturers, many of the small businesses who want to make that investment. Part of it stems from the fact that our financial lending institutions may not have the capacity. They may not understand the sector adequately, or their instruments may not have been designed to support sustainable energy. Any thoughts on that, and what recommendations would you have to help address that challenge?
Actually, one of the objectives of the revised energy policy is to look at green financing and to look at how our local financial institutions can play their part in access to finance for persons willing to invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy. A lot of times we place a lot of emphasis on attracting what's out there, but we also need to focus on what's here. I believe St. Lucia has a lot of potential, and as Mr. Bernard mentioned earlier, it all boils down to public education. If entities and if the citizenry are aware of what exists or what can be done, I believe that they will be more willing to want to participate. So government now has a big job ahead in terms of public awareness and public education in terms of.
So I think the point was made that government sets the vision. It develops the policy in consultation with all the stakeholders, but it can be a little slow. And we know why it can be slow, because really government wears several hats, and it has to really pull in several partners together to make it work. The private sector often seems a little faster. They're a little more agile, and they can respond faster. I suspect Mr. Bernard, in representing his organization, may want the country to go a little faster. Mr. Bernard, the NERC shared its vision for the sustainable energy transition of St. Lucia. What do you think the manufacturers want for our sustainable energy transition?
I think reasonably you had a target of 35% by 2020. And I'm saying that, if we can generate 35% of our power in-house, and again, I take the very valid point that Lucelec cannot be a standby generating plant. Exactly. It has to be looked after and cherished. It's probably one of the best utility companies in the Caribbean. So we recognize that, and we know of their importance and their infrastructure and so on. But we want to find a formula that works for everybody, a win-win for everybody. And going back to the financing, and I remember the green financing that went through the SLDB with the CAF, and essentially that was money at 4 or 4.5%. But I'm not sure that the uptake was as fast as it needed to be. And essentially that was because people, again, just don't understand the ROI. And Mrs. Jean made the point that it really does not affect your bottom line, because your savings essentially pay your finance charges for the installation for 5 years. And after that 5 years has passed, it's all yours. So, and we've tried to portray that message, but I think, you need the heavy hitters, you need the government departments to really go out there and educate and show how this works, so that people can say, wow, this is a great idea.
I think that was a point, but speaking in consultation with different partners, we've also received feedback that some of the administrative processes have also been quite onerous. And so I think there's also the opportunity, as you said, sustainable energy really is a national effort. And so even the financial institutions need to understand how to make this a little more accessible. How to, make things like you may have a one-stop shop, how to reduce the paperwork involved, how to build their own capacity, so that the persons who are uptaking this, feel comfortable, and, they don't feel that they have to go through a whole very long, convoluted way. So perhaps let's just go back to the geothermal, because I think whereas we have a lot of work on solar, whereas I think it's very easy for an individual to access through the NERC a solar PV system, even if we may say that we may need to look at some of the quotas and the sizes to allow for greater distributed generation. What are the plans for geothermal?
Okay. Geothermal energy, the government recently rolled out or initiated a project called the Renewable Energy Sector Development Project, with financing from the World Bank. And the development objective surrounds confirming the geothermal resource. So undertaking an exploration drilling project to confirm and characterize St. Lucia's geothermal potential, with a view, if it's viable, to move to power plant development, and also to strengthen the regulatory framework for private sector investments within the energy space. So these two very important objectives are being pursued. The project is really an geothermal exploration drilling project that builds on a project called the Geothermal Resource Development Project, a surface exploration project that indicated that there was no added value in continuing surface exploration work, but rather St. Lucia should pursue an exploration drilling project to determine the nature and characteristics of its geothermal resource. The geothermal drilling will take place in 3 areas: in the southwestern portion of the island, in a place called Montleza, in Saltibus, in Fort Saint-Jacques-Soufrière, and also in Belle Plaine. 2 very important components the project has. The first deals with the exploration drilling component, the hiring of an exploration management consultancy firm. That's a group of experts who will manage the entire drilling campaign. It also deals with the hiring of a drilling services contractor, and also civil and infrastructural works contracts will be sorted out there. The other component is also very important, and it has to do with technical assistance and capacity building. Capacity building for whom? Very important stakeholders within the sector, the National Utilities Regulatory Commission, NERC, the government and other stakeholders, and it will also provide support for completing some of the legislative work that is required to give that sort of certainty to investors to attract them to our market. So it's outside of geothermal, it's also supporting the broader renewable energy approach of the government.
So going back to our theme about reduction, I guess when we speak about subjects like geothermal, we're really looking to reduce our dependence on imported fossil fuel. I know we are still at an early stage, but what is the estimated contribution that geothermal could make to our energy mix in St. Lucia?
Okay, so based on the assessments, we are looking at a 30 megawatt geothermal plant.
And what is our current capacity, installed capacity?
The 88.4 installed capacity, but the base load for St. Lucia, I think, would subject to correction in the mid-30s. So geothermal could potentially be that source of energy. It's dispatchable, unlike solar, it's not variable. It can meet the everyday needs of the grid of our country.
So I'm going to ask a question perhaps Mr. Bernard may be a little reluctant to ask. We've been discussing geothermal for several years. We've started since the 1950s. Why are we still pursuing it? And what impact would geothermal have on, say, the manufacturers, for example? How does it support the different segments? How do we envision it will support the different segments of our population?
So certainly, geothermal, what it does, and you mentioned it, the issue of energy independence and the fact that we will not be so dependent on imported fossil fuels, it means that we'll be cushioned from all of the vagaries of the international oil market, especially the pricing. So there will be stability and predictability, more predictability in electricity prices in St. Lucia. So Mr. Barnard would be able to plan better. He knows how to roll out his investments as it relates to his electricity costs. He will not be surprised by a conflict in Ukraine or some other supply disruption that may take place and have a negative impact on electricity prices in St. Lucia. And also, I think it's important that we don't forget the environmental aspects of it as well. Because with a 30 megawatt geothermal plant, we will see significant reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions, and that will propel us to surpass not only our renewable energy targets, but also our emissions reductions targets as part of our revised nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement.
Okay. So let me congratulate the government of St. Lucia on the successes to date with the geothermal. I think it really speaks well to the commitment towards geothermal, which is important not only for St. Lucia, but for many of the rest of the OECS member states. I was just thinking in the context of what we are discussing, I will pose that question to Mrs. Shah. Are our plans and targets achievable?
I think they are. I believe they are, and I am one of the very strong proponents of energy sustainability for our country. The slow pace of our progress is a little worrying. I think we could have achieved much more had we dedicated ourselves to the various tasks that are required. Because about 10 years ago, St. Lucia was much further ahead in terms of renewable energy development. But we slowed down somewhere during the process. But they are achievable. I think having the proper legislative framework, the political will, but most importantly, having a champion or champions of energy would be important to achieving the goals and the targets that have been set. But most certainly, we're seeing other countries in the Caribbean and in the world achieve their goals, and I think St. Lucia has the potential and the resources to do likewise.
Thank you, Mrs. Joe. And at this point, we will take our second break. When we come back, we will be looking at how we can support the achievement of those sustainable energy goals.
Do you run a business? Do you use data in your decision making? Meet Gina and Lyle, two entrepreneurs Gina knows that if she wants her business to grow, she must rely on quality data to make the right decisions. Gina uses ProTool. ProTool tells Gina how well her business is performing and tells her where she needs to make changes. Gina's data-driven decisions are working. Her business grows stronger and more profitable. Lyle makes his business decisions from his gut. Who needs data? After all, he knows what's best and does not need figures to tell him how to run his business. Lyle notices the business is struggling. He does not know why or what he needs to change. The business is crumbling. Gina has the winning formula. A business guided by data-driven decisions becomes profitable. Use ProTool to measure the productivity of your business and reap the rewards. ProTool. Plan to succeed with data-driven solutions.
The Department of Finance has introduced the Electronic Government Procurement System, EGP. The EGP system has many benefits for stakeholders involved in government procurement. And government seeks to adopt a strategic approach to its purchasing process. Electronic government procurement improves efficiency of procurement and enhances data capture. The EGP is innovative and will automate the sequence from notification, receiving and evaluation of submissions to final contract award. It improves communication between vendors and government agencies, provides greater transparency and builds confidence in the vendor community through increased access to information. To participate, vendors, suppliers, and contractors must register on the Electronic Government Procurement Platform. EGP, improving efficiency and transparency in the acquisition of goods, works, and services.
Welcome back to our panel discussion on energy awareness, the reduction strategy. In our previous sessions, I think we discussed how we could reduce our wastage of energy. We've discussed how we can reduce our importation of foreign fossil fuel. And I think at this point, it's timely that we discuss how we can reduce the time for implementation of projects on the ground. So perhaps we'll start with Mr. Bernard. Just before our break, we were told that geothermal, like the other forms of renewable energy, indigenous renewable energy, could support the manufacturing sector. What would you propose as recommendations to help really reduce this time lag for seeing projects on the ground? It doesn't have to be with respect to geothermal, but with respect to more solar and more other forms of sustainable energy measures.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that you have to set targets and you have to adhere to them. I think you need to keep key players in ministries that are there already and stop moving them around so that basically they can concentrate on the job. That's just what I've observed over the last 12 years. It is very important, if we can get our costs down, we become much more competitive. Within 1,000 miles of here, there are people who are paying 10 US cents per kilowatt hour. There's subsidies in Martinique for EDF. There is very low prices of electricity in Trinidad. For us to get into that and being able to have that unit cost come down, we have to act quickly. And again, I bring up the cost of living crisis that we're going through now. If there are ways and means out there, we should be concentrating on them and going fervently at them.
Okay. Mrs. Jha, regulations, it always comes up. Can it be the game changer?
It's part of the game change. I just want to go back to Mr. Bernard and to caution against comparisons without looking at all of the factors that go into each jurisdiction. Martinique is a dependent of France, and their rates are set by the motherland, so they are highly subsidized. Trinidad has oil. They use purely fossil fuels for their power generation. The price of electricity is down. So we have to look at each jurisdiction, each country, and what goes into their energy. So be careful about making comparisons like that. For us at the NUC, what we've been doing is really preparing ourselves to be able to more effectively regulate the sector. And so far, what we've done, through grant assistance, we've been able to finalize the grid code, which is the body of rules that will manage the way the grid operates. That we've done and have passed on to the government of St. Lucia.
Can you tell us a little about the grid code?
But it's more of a technical code that really speaks to all of the different requirements that the utility would need to adhere to in order to regulate or to manage the electricity or electric grid. So it's a highly technical document, but there are other aspects of the code which relates to the consumers, what consumers can expect, what technical people have to do, and different things like that. So we've finalized that and has been passed. It will be part of the legislation because it's going to be the guide for the utility company. We've armed ourselves with a strategic plan, an operational plan for the NERC itself. We're now, as we speak, undergoing a study of microgrids for St. Lucia. And microgrids, again, would look at smaller electric grids and how they can be integrated within the wider national grid and the effects that it can have. But we're looking at it also in the context of climate resilience, because in the event that we have a national disaster, especially hurricanes, whether we can establish these small grids in various strategic parts of the island that could support certain key institutions and communities. So for example, if we're looking at a scenario of Dennery being locked out through the Badlil or through Monrepo, whether Dennery by itself can still have its electricity, even though the feed from the other sources have been lost. We're looking at the north of the island as well, police stations, certain key hurricane shelters, and so on. So the NERC, through a grant from the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, is pursuing that study. We've engaged in the review of the new Electricity Act, gave comments to the government of St. Lucia. We've engaged in capacity building for our commissioners and staff, because the NERC is governed by a commission of 7 individuals appointed by the Minister for Public Utilities. So all of that we're doing, and we've prepared the various guidelines and forms and everything in order that when the act comes into being, we're advanced and prepared to go. So while we've had a slow pace of implementation to get to this stage, we really want to be in a position to hit the ground running when the new legislation comes on board, because I know that there's anxiety among the business sector for a greater infusion of electricity, of renewable energy, into our electricity mix.
I think you brought up a very important point in terms of the microgrids. I see it in the context of our theme, reducing outages. We do live in a vulnerable part of the world where we experience hurricanes, as you said, and energy is vital to all aspects. It's health, education, transportation. And if we can use sustainable energy as a means of supporting continuity of business after an event, through a microgrid or through battery storage, it really helps to reduce our reductions and allow us to work efficiently.
What we also need to bear in mind, Madam Moderator, is that, and perhaps that might be the reason for the apprehension towards renewable energy. In the past, renewable energy equipment was expensive. Solar was quite phenomenal. But as the years go by, we're seeing a reduction in the cost. businesses need to now, business establishments need to do their research and realize that it would be much cheaper for them to utilize some of these appliances to reduce on their electricity consumption. So it's something that should be pursued. Perhaps the Manufacturers Association and the SLHT and the others can bring us together and let's sit at the table and let's explore these approaches in order for them to get greater benefit from the system.
And just before we wrap up, the government of St. Lucia has been doing quite a bit of public awareness, quite a bit of capacity building. But how do we encourage greater participation in the sustainable energy markets at the national level? What is being done and what do you hope to see in the future?
Engagement. It's not a one-man show. It involves speaking to our stakeholders, inclusive of government agencies like ourselves, and bringing forth the objective. What is our objective? What do we want to achieve? Do we want to be independent, energy independent, and how do we get there? We have the roadmap. How do we follow it? What is needed? So it's all a matter of collaborating, and not only with the government agencies, but with the regulator, the manufacturers. It's a job for society, not just government.
Okay, so I take the word collaboration.
Yes, absolutely. And again, government's policy formulation function, it's always an attempt to reduce asymmetries with various stakeholders, and it's very important that we achieve so. And as she rightly said, it's done through collaboration. I think it's clear that we have common objectives. The Manufacturers Association, Mr. Barnard, has made it clear, and we would continue to promote the approach of energy conservation and energy efficiency first, and then we move to renewable energy. Renewable energy is not a cure for all, right? But we have to be very efficient with what we have, our usage. We avoid wastage of energy as much as possible. These are much cheaper interventions, very much shorter payback periods, and this is what we will promote, as well as the renewable energy agenda. So again, looking forward to building on the partnerships. They've been very patient, they've done a wonderful job, and we hope to equip them with the legislation that they require very soon. So we see a greater pace of movement in terms of renewable energy integration.
Okay, so I get from the government, one word that would describe your vision for the future would be collaboration and partnerships. From the private sector, the Manufacturers Association, one word?
I'm absolutely sure that whether it be the Chamber of Commerce, the Manufacturers Association, or SLHTA, they would sit down at any given opportunity to dialogue and get this thing moving as quickly as possible.
I say action. I say we need to move beyond the discussions and have tangible demonstration of what we want to achieve. I think together with the government, we can pursue projects that would actually bring about some of these changes for some organizations, for the business sector, so that they can market these projects for their members, so their members would realize that it's not just talk. Because a lot of people look at us and with these government people, they just come in and talk. But if there's tangible demonstration of what we're talking about, then the appetite for accepting it would be better. So for me, action.
So there we have it, collaboration and partnerships, action. And I think that we've had a very rich discussion. I want to thank our panelists today for sharing your information with us. I think it was so good to hear from the Manufacturers Association, so good to hear from the NERC. It's a new organization, but I think you were able to share with us what you've been doing. And certainly from the government, sharing its plans and what has been achieved. And we really hope that this has been enlightening. This, as I said, has been part of the activities to observe Productivity Awareness Week. This is clearly a sign that energy is being mainstreamed. It certainly contributes to productivity. And I hope that this discussion here today has really helped you to see how we can reduce energy wastage, reduce on our importation of fossil fuels, reduce on our occurrences of energy disruptions, and finally reduce on our expenditure, which will hopefully add a little more to our pockets and to the quality of our life. Thank you so much. My name is Judith Ephraim-Schmidt. Thank you for viewing, and we hope that you have a very productive and energy efficient week ahead.